Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we're tracing the absolutely wild evolution of the FBI. I mean, think about it. An organization that today battles global cybercriminals from these massive server farms. It literally started out with a bunch of guys in bowler hats chasing paper trails. So let's dive right into this. How exactly did a tiny, kind of obscure investigation force evolve into one of the world's most powerful agencies? It's a huge question, right? Because when you look at the scope of the modern FBI, it is absolutely staggering. We're talking about an agency dealing with everything from foreign spies and international terrorists to global cybercriminals operating from thousands of miles away. But as you'll see, it definitely didn't start out that way. And that brings us to the fascinating duality of the agency's legacy. For over a century now, the FBI has basically stood right at the center of American history. To some folks, it is widely celebrated as America's premier law enforcement agency, praised for protecting the nation. But at the exact same time, to others, it is one of the most controversial institutions in the country, facing intense criticism for some of its investigative practices. Our goal today? We're just strictly looking at the history to see how this incredibly complex agency was built from the ground up. So here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, the birth of the FBI, then a new era, followed by the gangster years, and finally, science changes everything. Let's look at what forced law enforcement to completely level up their tactics in the early 20th century. Section 1, the birth of the FBI. Let's rewind to the year 1908. At the turn of the century, America was industrializing incredibly fast, and criminals were suddenly using trains and cars to cross state lines just to avoid capture. Local police? They were basically powerless. Recognizing this massive loophole, Attorney General Charles Bonaparte established the Bureau of Investigation in 1908, and from there, the evolution is just rapid fire. We hit the 1920s with prohibition fueling organized crime, then the pivotal appointment of J. Edgar Hoover in 1924, right into the Great Depression and gangster era of the 1930s, culminating in the infamous death of John Dillinger in 1934. But let's go back to that very beginning, a few dozen. That is literally it. When the Department of Justice first established this new Bureau of Investigation, or BOI, it consisted of only a few dozen investigators. Their original focus was incredibly narrow. We're talking just investigating fraud, corruption, and some very specific violations of federal law. Not exactly a global powerhouse, right? Nobody at the time could have imagined this tiny, almost invisible group would one day become so massive. Section 2, a new era. Now we're stepping into the 1920s, a time when public confidence in traditional law enforcement was taking a nosedive. And a huge reason for that was prohibition. Banning alcohol was originally meant to eliminate crime, but, ironically, it actually fueled the rise of violently competitive, wildly lucrative organized criminal networks. Gangsters were suddenly getting insanely wealthy through bootlegging and illegal gambling. This created a massive underground economy that completely overwhelmed local police forces. They just couldn't keep up. Enter a young government official named J. Edgar Hoover. Taking over as director in 1924, Hoover realized, very quickly I might add, that to combat these sophisticated, well-funded, organized networks, the Bureau itself had to professionalize. He came in and completely overhauled the whole system. He demanded strict hiring standards, mandated extensive agent training, and heavily pushed for scientific investigation. Under Hoover, the Bureau was finally transforming into a modern organization. Section 3, the gangster years. So the Great Depression hits, creating massive economic desperation across America, which naturally led to a huge spike in bank robberies. And what's really interesting here is the sheer volume of legendary outlaws operating all at once. You've got John Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, Babyface Nelson, Pretty Boy Floyd. These infamous criminals were capturing newspaper headlines literally every single day. And they were completely overwhelming local authorities with a ridiculously simple trick. They'd just intentionally drive across a state border where local cops legally couldn't follow them. It was a complete nightmare for law enforcement. So, how did the federal government finally respond to all this chaos? Well, it took a horrific tragedy. The devastating kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh Jr., the infant son of the famous aviator, deeply shocked the entire nation. In direct response to the massive public outcry, Congress actually passed much stronger federal kidnapping laws. This was a game changer. It finally granted the Bureau massive new investigative authority to pursue these dangerous fugitives across state lines. This specific tragedy acted as a major catalyst for permanently expanding federal law enforcement powers. Armed with these sweeping new powers, agents began aggressively tracking down notorious fugitives. One of their absolute most famous operations was the 1934 shootout that resulted in the death of John Dillinger outside a Chicago theater. Successes exactly like this entirely shifted the public image of the agency overnight. Newspapers started celebrating federal agents as G-men, short for government men, of course. And Hollywood films quickly jumped on the bandwagon, popularizing this new image of the sharp, disciplined federal investigator bravely pursuing America's most dangerous criminals.
Section 4. Science changes everything.
And that brings us to the final major transformation of this era. You see, to truly beat the criminals, the agency realized they had to actually outsmart them. The old methods relied heavily on confessions and witness testimony, methods that, let's be honest, are highly subjective, prone to error, and often completely unreliable. But the new standard? Fingerprints, ballistics, document analysis, and photography. For the very first time, criminal investigations were increasingly relying on objective, concrete, scientific evidence instead of just trying to sweat a suspect into a confession. These forensic innovations were an absolute game changer. Fingerprint databases were massively expanded, allowing for precise, undeniable identification. Ballistic specialists could now meticulously match specific bullets to specific firearms, literally linking criminals to crime scenes with pure science. Meanwhile, document analysts were expertly identifying forged signatures. These specific scientific methods dramatically improved accuracy. They helped solve cases that previously seemed totally impossible to crack. And through this innovation, the FBI literally became the gold standard, a model for modern police departments everywhere across the United States. So by the late 1930s, the FBI had completely transformed. They went from that tiny, obscure office of a few dozen investigators into a formidable national institution. Its legendary reputation was firmly cemented through those high-profile gangster cases we talked about, the sweeping advances in forensic science, and, of course, their constantly expanding federal authority. They had basically built an incredible machine, one perfectly designed to fight domestic crime. Which leaves us with a pretty massive question. How will this fundamentally domestic agency handle the unprecedented espionage of World War II, Cold War national security, and all the civil rights surveillance controversies that follow? The greatest challenges were still ahead. The world was about to change dramatically, and the FBI would find itself deeply entangled in some massive global and ethical challenges. We're going to explore exactly how they navigated all of that in part 2. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will catch you next time.